Most of us have seen what happens when leadership collapses. A company loses its CEO unexpectedly. Department head is fired. It will be interesting to see what happens next in Iran. The loss of all of its leadership. Sometimes the loss of leadership is a bad thing. It's a hard thing. And sometimes, in this case, it might bode very well for the nation. But often a power vacuum forms, and suddenly people who were once loyal become strategic. Rumors circulate, alliances shift, and decisions that once were thought of as being unthinkable now have a justification. And all because, at the end of the day, survival is at stake. 2 Samuel 4 places us inside such a moment. Saul is dead. His general Abner has been murdered. David has been anointed by king, by God, and does not yet functionally rule the whole nation. Israel is fractured. She is anxious. She is afraid. And into that fear step two men who believe that the advancing God's purposes requires human violence and moral shortcuts. So this chapter presses home a timeless question for God's people. Will we trust God to establish His kingdom in His way and time, or will we try to secure the future through unrighteous means? That's an important question. And it's pressed home to us through the stratagems of the people in this text. Will we trust God to establish His kingdom in His way at His time? Or will we try to secure the future by means that are unrighteous, unbiblical? Let's watch how that works in our text in front of us today. It opens in chapter 4, verses 1 through 7, with the collapse of the house of Saul. And this chapter opens not with action, as we have seen in other chapters, but with fear. In verse 1, when Ishbosheth, Saul's son, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, his courage failed, and all Israel was dismayed. So the house begins its final fall by a paralyzing fear. Ishbosheth hears that his commander, the one who had guided him, the one who ultimately really had controlled him, the one who had put him on the throne of Israel, he heard that Abner was dead. His courage failed, and all Israel was dismayed, which brings into question his courage, just to start with. See, Abner was the real power behind Saul's son. And his death that occurred in the chapter before this exposes just how hollow and fragile this kingdom and its king had become. You see, leadership built on sheer power collapses when that power disappears. Ishbosheth has a title, no real authority. The authority was in Abner. Without Abner, his reign disintegrates almost overnight. And fear tends to spread downward. The text says that all Israel is dismayed when the leaders lack confidence, when the leaders lose their courage. Instability among God's people multiplies. But God is at work. God often reveals false foundations by removing its supports. Saul's house does not fall because David attacks it, but because it cannot stand on its own. God is at work sometimes when we build our life on sand, on false foundations, on things that will not sustain through eternity. Then God often moves to pull those out from under us so that the ensuing difficulty and maybe even personal collapse causes us to cast ourselves wholly on Him, to depend on Him. And sometimes we look at what is going on as a bad thing rather than recognizing the good that God intends and the glory that He brings. So this sets the stage. Fear creates opportunity. And opportunity invites compromise. So the house of Saul falls from an internal danger, verses 2 through 3. Now Saul's son had two men who were captains of raiding bands. The name of the one was Baanah, and the name of the other Rechab. They were the sons of Rimmon, a man of Benjamin from Beeroth. For Beeroth is counted part of Benjamin. The Beeroth fled to get him and have been sojourners there to this day. I love the sort of, let me explain something that doesn't mean anything to us. But the author of Samuel has to explain something that, where did these people come from? Why are they here? Why are they sojourners? Let me tell you, these two guys were from, and they fled later, and they went to this, and there they are to this day. There's a sense of realism there, isn't there? It's like, let me comment on something here because I don't want you to be confused. And then we're sitting here 3,000, 4,000 years later confused. The two brothers, Rechab and Baanah, commanders in Saul's forces, see their chance. They are heads of raiding parties. They are sort of scouts. They are people who are used to fighting and fighting on the move. And they have a kind of power. But fear of the fall of Saul's house is going to drive them to murder. Their moral compass is skewed. They think that what is best for them is also approved by God and best for David. But the house is going to fall with a vulnerable heir in verse 4. The narrator pauses to introduce Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. So we have Saul's son, his heart failing him, and now we have Mephibosheth, whose body has failed him. Look at the text, verse 4. Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. And his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame. And his name was Mephibosheth. See, he is disabled as a child. He was dropped while fleeing after Saul and Jonathan's death. And now he lives in obscurity. His story is not directly connected to the plot that is unfolding now, but it is interesting to introduce him in this context. Saul's son has rebelled. Saul's son has led a false... And there are two men who are going to turn on him. And if you know the story of Mephibosheth, what glorious and gracious difference. But that story for another day. He is no threat to the throne. He may be a son of Jonathan, but the royal line is not going through him. But his story, when it unfolds, will be wonderfully theological. See, the cost of Saul's downfall is generational. Mephibosheth's suffering is not the result of his own sin, but connected to all of the collapse around him. Powerlessness marks Saul's remaining line. This house cannot defend itself. It cannot advance itself. It cannot even preserve itself. And this is embodied in the pathetic, crippled, lame in his feet son of Jonathan. So God's purposes quietly continue through overlooked lives. See, this brief mention will prepare us for grace later when David will restore Mephibosheth, not because of usefulness, but on sheer covenant love. But here, the text whispers that God's kingdom is not built on strength. The house falls in a plotted assassination in verses 5 through 7. Now the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, Reshab and Benaiah, set out, and about the heat of the day they came to the house of Ishbosheth as he was taking his noonday rest. And they came into the midst of the house as if to get wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. And then Reshab and Benaiah, his brother, escaped. And when they came to the house, as he lay on his bed in his bedroom, they struck him and put him to death and beheaded him. One commentator said, sort of jokingly, there's a lot of people losing their heads in these stories. So these two brothers, Reshab and Benaiah, see their chance. They enter in Ishbosheth's house. They do it during the midday rest. They assassinate him, decapitate him, and flee to David. And look at how fear breeds pragmatism. These men are not driven by loyalty to David, nor a concern for justice. Their fear seeks survival, and their ambition seizes the chance. In their mind, violence is reframed as strategy. Murder becomes a means of political realignment. Justification is necessary for the action that's taken. God's anointed king becomes a justification for sin. They assume that because David will benefit, then that their actions will be accepted and are righteous. This is one of the most dangerous spiritual mistakes. We must never confuse results with righteousness. And living in a pragmatic culture and living in a pragmatic society, This is a great warning for us. Just because it gets the ends that we think are right and righteous does not mean that every means that even brings that end is itself righteous. Never confuse results with righteousness. And the king is misread. In verses 7 and 8, they took his head and went by the way of Arabah all night and brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron. And they said to the king, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. The Lord has avenged my lord the king this day on Saul and on his offspring." Here's their presentation. The brothers present Ishbosheth's head to David. To us, this is a gruesome scene. It's too easy for easy Westernism to associate this with the worst of modern evildoers. But the presentation of the head of the enemy was a common way in their world to assert a full and decisive victory. See, they believe that David is looking for vengeance. They say, "God has given vengeance to you today." They fully expect David to agree with them, right? I mean, why would you do this? And the king is misread in the way they present it and in their assumptions. They assume a false image of the king. That David works through bloodshed, betrayal, and momentary expediency. Everything we have seen so far would deny that. David has exercised often justice and mercy. And they assume that God's name can be invoked to legitimize their sin. See, this is not atheism. This is a religious justification. God is often invoked by religious people to justify irreligious acts, right? That's not unusual. And they assume David wants success more than faithfulness. And they project their own lack of values onto the king. They think he is like them, or worse, they think he is ultimately like Saul. They assume that they are participating in the fulfillment of God's promise to David. They have misunderstood how God fulfills his promises and how God carries out his purposes. God's sovereignty can never be used to excuse human evil. This moment exposes how easily we can confuse God's end with ungodly means. But the house of David stands. David's response is immediate and decisive. Verse 9, and David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, "As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when one told me, 'Behold, Saul is dead,' and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news." At this moment, those two brothers' hearts have just dropped, right? And how much more when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house, on his bed, shall I not require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth? And God commanded his young men, and they killed them and cut off their hands and feet and hanged them beside the pool at Hebron. And they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner at Hebron. Now, David's house stands by moral clarity. David swears by the Lord who has redeemed his life from all trouble. He recalls the execution, the Amalekite who claimed to kill Saul. And David grounds his response in God's character, not political advantage. God is his deliverer, and therefore David does not need to grasp for power. This points us to Christ in Philippians 2, who did not think that the power and the position of equality with God the Father, a thing to be grasped onto. Past faithfulness then shapes David's present integrity. David remembers how God has already acted, and that memory restrains him. Murder does not become righteous because the victim is weak. Ishbosheth may be ineffective, but he's still innocent. And David refuses to build his throne on unjust bloodshed. But there is unswerving justice, verse 12. David executes the murderers and publicly displays their punishment. And once again, David does something most of us would not have done. He honors Ishbosheth in death. This is becoming a theme in the book of Samuel. David grieves for both friend and foe. He writes a sad song grieving for Saul. He deeply grieves for Jonathan. He honors and sings for Abner. And now he grieves the death of the last of Saul's sons and his rival for the throne. Public justice protects the moral center of David's rising kingdom. David is shaping not just a throne, but a people. Leadership setting the example for the people to follow. They are to follow not just because he is king, but because David is pointing them to God and what God is like and what God truly requires. Righteous leadership resists cynicism. David refuses to say, well, this is just how the world works. Thank you, guys. God's kingdom must reflect and will reflect God's character and his ways, even when it seems slow in progress. This chapter ends with clarity. God's kingdom cannot be advanced by unrighteousness. How do we think about this? Well, first, beginning with David to Christ, David shines here, and even David is not enough. Later, his kingdom will be marked by violence and failure and compromise. 2 Samuel awakens a deeper longing for a king who does not merely refuse violence, but actually absorbs that Jesus Christ is that king. Ishbosheth is murdered in weakness, but Jesus is crucified in obedience. David refuses to seize the throne by bloodshed, but Jesus established his throne by shedding his own blood, not the blood of others. And human kingdoms rise by killing rivals. God's kingdom comes by the death of the king for his enemies. The New Covenant reveals that God's kingdom advances not through coercion, but through the cross. Not by human faithfulness, but by Christ's finished work. So how do we bring this text to our own lives? This passage invites us to trust God's timing when fear tempts us to manipulate outcomes. What a lesson to learn. It invites us to trust God's timing when fear tempts us to manipulate outcomes. Our agenda rather than submitting to God's agenda. And it exposes how easily we can justify compromise when it seems to advance good and greater goals. Why wouldn't we? Maybe because it's wrong. But we do. And it reminds us that God does not need our sin to accomplish his purposes. In fact, I would go even further. That God rejects our sin to accomplish his purposes. And it frees us to rest in a kingdom secured not by our own actions, but by Christ's obedience. Now we have a little time, so I'd like to go a little deeper and think about this. How will we respond when support systems collapse? When Abner dies, Ishbosheth loses courage and the people become unsettled. Text doesn't condemn him. It simply shows what happens when the figure holding things together disappears. This invites us to reflect on what happens inside us when a stabilizing presence is gone, a leader, a role, a routine, a relationship, a spouse. And rather than judging that fear, the passage lets us notice how fragile confidence can be when it rests on something external and temporal. The simple lesson: rest your life on the eternal. Do not put more weight on anything except God than He intended for it to bear. This awareness can help us recognize where our own sense of steadiness is coming from and how it might respond under pressure. And recognize a temptation to interpret chaos as opportunity. In unsettled moments, it's easy to confuse possibility with permission. Let me say that again, because I want you to wrap your minds around that. It is easy to confuse possibility with permission. That's exactly what they did. The story invites us to notice when we start narrating events in ways that conveniently justify our own advantage. It's less about condemning ambition and more about becoming aware of how quickly we can frame self-alignment, self-interest, as alignment with the bigger picture. And understand the gap between intentions and impacts. See, the assassins clearly believe that they are bringing good news to David. Their interpretation of events is sincere, but disastrously wrong. This highlights how meaning is not self-assigned. What we intend and how our actions are received may diverge sharply, and the passage encourages a kind of humility about our interpretations. The willingness to pause and ask whether what we are thinking about doing actually reflects the values, the character, the virtues that we think they do. Rather than assuming that since we are sincere, that guarantees alignment with God's purposes, God's character. Again, such a common thing in our culture today. People can say, I meant well. Well, good on you. Another thing to observe here is to refuse shortcuts even when they benefit you. And I'm going to say even spiritual shortcuts. David could have accepted the outcome and distanced himself from the method. Instead, he confronts it directly, rejects the violence, even though it removes his revival and strengthens his position. The moment draws attention to the inner line between benefit and buy-in. The story invites reflection on whether we quietly accept outcomes we didn't cause, kind of feel uneasy about, and what it looks like to take responsibility for the kind of world that we are willing to inherit. It's less about heroism and more about coherence between what we believe is true and valuable and virtuous and outcomes, even in God's kingdom. See, this chapter ends not with celebration, but with burial. Heads laid to rest, bodies removed, violence acknowledged but not glorified. The story resists a triumphant tone when that tone could have easily been struck. And this suggests that not every turning point needs to feel victorious in order to be meaningful. Sometimes the most faithful response to disruption is closure rather than celebration. The passage leaves space for grief, complexity, and unfinished emotion. And sometimes as Christians, we are looking for black and white, for clear resolution, for an absolute definite line. And in this sermon, I have intentionally chosen not to do that. This is intended to make you think, to make you pause. And if you don't want to think as a Christian, then this isn't going to benefit you as I hope it will. Pause and think about your world and your relationships and what you are trying to achieve in the church, in the kingdom, in yourself. This is an invitation to let some moments remain sober rather than rushing them towards some kind of triumph. Maybe here's a better way. Rather than asking, what are the lessons of 2 Samuel 4? Maybe it might be better lived by asking ourselves some penetrating questions. What do I tend to justify when things feel unstable, not quite right? What do I tend to justify? Where am I tempted to accept outcomes without examining the cost? Where do I tend to work toward results, even if it compromises righteousness? And whose personhood, whose humanity, whose vulnerability becomes harder for me to see when I am under pressure? God is building His kingdom through the gospel. It's going throughout the world. It's going throughout the people groups. It will do so God's way and in God's time. And it is transforming His people into being like Christ. And this is not merely aspiration, but actuality. How are you then engaged with God's work here and in the world? Let's pray.